Hello and welcome. My name is Megan De Dios, and I serve the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry as Director of Continuing Education. Thanks to each of you for joining us for this webinar. As part of the school's mission, we offer an array of enrichment opportunities to foster Christian faith and promote lifelong learning. We do this by offering presentations such as this one, as well as online courses, videos, podcasts, and other resources for personal enrichment and professional development. Our STM Online Crossroads courses for 2022 are well underway. Our next course, Psalms, Prayer for All Times, begins on April 13th. Please visit our website, bc.edu/crossroads, for more information on how to enroll. We will also include a link in the chat. Thanks to our speaker for granting us permission to record today's webinar. As soon as the recording of today's presentation is available for viewing, likely within a month, we will notify all registered participants of the availability of the recording. Throughout the presentation, there will be opportunities for conversation. Please feel free to enter a comment into a chat during these times, and please share any final questions and comments using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. The Q&A tab will be open throughout the presentation. We will aim to get to as many questions and comments as possible. Finally, we are also able to offer live closed captioning for today's webinar. You will notice a closed captioning button on the bottom of your screen to enable or disable the feature. Many thanks to Michaela, graduate student here at the STM, for assisting with the closed captioning for us today. I now invite Father Thomas Stegman, Dean of the School of Theology and Ministry, to introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation, Witnessing Jesus Hang, Reading the Gospel Account of Jesus' Crucifixion through African-American Biblical Histories. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker. Dr. Shively T.J. Smith is Assistant Professor of New Testament at Boston University School of Theology. Professor Smith completed her PhD in New Testament studies at that most distinguished of institutions of higher learning, Emory University. Under the same tutelage, we had the same doctor father. I just learned that time, so Dr. Luke Timothy Johnson. She'll make Dr. Johnson more proud than yours truly. She has published her first book called Strangers to Family, Diaspora and First Peter's Invention of God's Household. It's published by Baylor University Press. She has a second book that will be coming out on 2 Peter and 19th century African-American women, forthcoming in SBL Press. And we were talking about what she's done in that book, and I can say I'm personally looking forward to its appearance. Professor Smith has studied at a variety of institutions, including Fisk University, Emory University's Candler School of Theology, Columbia Theological Seminary. She's also studied at Oxford University as an English-speaking Union Lord Fellow. She's written numerous essays, including, these are some meaty titles here. One More Time with Asata on My Mind, a womanist rereading of the Escape to Egypt, the reference to Matthew 2, in dialogue with an African-American woman fugitive narrative. Another one named Witnessing Jesus Hang, Reading Mary Magdalene's View of Crucifixion through Ida B. Wells's Chronicles of Lynching. She's currently working on a new project on Howard Thurman and the Bible. From 2020-21, Dr. Smith was a teacher scholar of the Calvin Institute. This present academic year, she is a Louisville Institute Scholar of Color book grantee. She also serves as the scholar in residence at the Cathedral of the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and Metropolitan Church in Washington, D.C. Professor Smith is a sought-after scholar, teacher, preacher, and writer who is dedicated to the service of academic theological studies and ecumenical conversations across multiple arenas. We're very honored to have her join us virtually for this presentation. A very warm welcome to Professor Smith.
Thank you so much, Father Stegman, and thank you so much to the entire Boston College and the School of Theology, and particularly the continuing education department, and the invitation to bring and to talk with you, hopefully work with you a little bit regarding from the wheelhouse of some of my own scholarship and work. I'm very excited to share with you some of that work that has been shared already with you. I am going to share my screen, and so I have a presentation. So this is as much visual as it is oral, and so hopefully this will guide us this next hour or so through our learning. This is a continuing education cycle presentation. So though I will be talking to you virtually, I want to invite you to use the chat box if you have it available to sort of talk back to me in that. And my friend and colleague from Boston College, Megan, will help me look at that at different moments in time. So this is a perfect time for you to get a piece of paper, because you are actually going to do a little bit of work with the text as we do this, as we explore our subject matter together. So let me share my screen. So as it's been shared with you, the title of my presentation today is called Witnessing Jesus Hang, Reading the Gospel Accounts of Jesus' Crucifixion Through African-American Biblical Histories. I really am interested in us thinking about what we might learn or see related to the gospel cycle of the crucifixion, the death of Jesus on the cross passage, particularly as we're turning our sights toward that now in this Lenten season and what this means. So I think it's very appropriate for us to think about that and how we might think about it, understand it as we come at it through African-American biblical histories. So before we get into some of this work, I think it's very important for me to provide a bit of a description about how we are going to play this evening with text as what I like to call historically oriented people, as thinking people engaging biblical text stories and interpretations. And I suspect for many of us as faith-filled or faith-oriented people. So how do we come at this text as people who are identifying as a part of or participants in faith communities, as people of history? So we are historically located and historically oriented people. And then as thinking people, as people engaging the biblical text stories and interpretations also with our head. One of my standard mantras that people who engage me often come to know is I tend to talk about it as engaging the biblical text with head, heart, and hand. In embodiment as well. We'll see that come forth. As a biblical scholar, I enjoy playing at a very interesting intersection in which three different paths of discourse, three different trains of thought, three different lines of questioning or even curiosity meet for me. It is where I like to play this intersection, this cross section of biblical interpretation, and that I'm going to use in our engagement today. So let me run that off for you. And I actually already started it, but I want to give you a little bit more way to understand it. When I talk about us as faith-guided or faith-focused people, as a faith-focused line of investigation and curiosity, we're coming at the text by asking about meaning and questions of connection and faith. What does the death of Jesus mean for us as a people of faith? What does this tell us about suffering and faith, life and death, relationships of power, relationships of community? What do we understand about God's presence and power and love in the midst of persecution of innocent people? Even when we think about Jesus' innocence is something that you see declared in Luke's particular death on the cross cycle. Where is God in this death? And how do we believe in a God who allows things such to happen? So one line of inquiry that shows up and that's sort of underlying this entire presentation is one that is focused on this faith-focused line of investigation and curiosity. These questions of faith, these questions of faith, of ethics, these questions of orientations to God and human beings and earth come up for us in this discussion. The second line of questioning is that headline of questioning, the scholarly line of investigation and interpreting. It is the questions of the mind, it is the questions that scholars we tend to ask. This is where traditionally biblical scholars are known for living, right? We focus on matters of history and language. What is the world like that crucifies folks like Jesus? That's my Southern self coming out. Folks like Jesus, people like Jesus. And what happens to the identity of someone like Jesus when they are assigned the stigma of a crucified one in the world? This is something people tend to miss. Jesus, historically, is not understood to be a citizen of Rome, as we understand it as Paul with Roman citizenship. Yet it does not appear that Jesus was an enslaved person of the ancient world. So a free person of Galilee, not a citizen of the Roman Empire, a Jew. But then at crucifixion, at the moment of crucifixion, is there a designation in the world that is mapped onto Jesus at his death that we need to pay attention to? So what is the stigma, the understanding of status, rank, and place that is mapped onto Jesus as a crucified one in the world? Does the account of Jesus' death on the cross, as found in the Gospels, appear standard? Or is it unique in some ways to other people who are crucified in this world? Which brings me to the question of whether other people were crucified like Jesus in this world, in Jesus's world, in the world of the New Testament or the Christian Testament, in the world of the Roman Empire and beyond, that we need to pay attention to. Another way to say that would be, were there other Jesus-like people killed in the ancient world or contemporary modern times that we need to think about and pay attention to as helpful resources for interpreting and understanding the crucifixion story? Related to that, I want to bring up some places to think about this. The line of investigation. So let me say the line of investigation for the social historian in African American studies. So there's that third sort of intersection. So the first was the faith-focused line of investigation that's informing this presentation. The second is the scholarly line of investigating or interpreting. And this third, the line of investigation as a social historian in African American studies. This is where we might ask, what is the history of African American engagement with the crucified Jesus story? How has the story of Jesus' crucifixion been received and interpreted by African Americans and African diaspora interpretive communities? Or we might ask, how does the forms of state-sanctioned violence or carceral processes historically plaguing African American experience and history texture or shape our reading of Jesus' crucifixions in the gospel? Does that history give the biblical story a particular significance, a particular meaning potential that we haven't resourced or paid attention enough in these seasons of Lent and entering into the Easter season? All right, so 3 lines of investigation: a faith-focused line of investigation and curiosity, a scholarly line of investigation that's attentive to matters of history, attentive to matters of language, attentive to matters of the ancient social historical world. And then this third line of context for me that's significant is paying attention to the interpretive context and history of African Americans' interactions with of the biblical text, but also contextual experience. All 3 of these come together in the work that we're going to do. With that, I have a pop quiz for you. So I hope you did get that piece of paper because I have a quick pop quiz and Megan is going to help me with this. We are going to build what I call a running interpretive worksheet, or in my graduate courses, they know these as exegetical worksheets. In other words, I want you to create a running record of notes as we work with the story of crucifixion. So the pop quiz is this: what do you remember about the gospel story of Jesus' death or crucifixion? Do not get out the biblical text. So you are not allowed to look at Mark 15, Matthew 27, Luke 23, John 19. We're not looking at those texts right now. John 9, we're not looking at those texts right now. We are, I'm wanting you to, from memory, write down all the details of the death on the cross of Jesus that you remember, that you know or you think you know, and do not check yourself. If you are near the chat box for our virtual experience on Zoom, I want to invite you to populate the chat box with those details. Let's see what we have in our community. Here's the question again. Pop quiz: what do you remember about the gospel story of Jesus' death or crucifixion? What are the details that you remember? Populate for me the Q&A or the chat box. Let's see what might pop up. Again, no cheating. This is all from memory. And Megan, if you're with me, if you see any popping up, will you, and probably let's give them about maybe 15 more seconds. Can you read for me any of those details that you hear?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're already getting some in. We have I thirst.
Wait a minute. Let's
give them more time. I'm sorry.
A few more seconds without our feedback. I also deal with the Black contemplative tradition through Howard Thurman, so I tend to be okay with a little bit of a pause. All right, 10 more seconds. All right, my friend, Megan, what are some of the details you see populating?
Yeah, so couple comments about the length. It was a long time that Jesus was stripped of his garment. The women were present. The phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
Language, yes.
Yes, he was crucified between two thieves. He had to carry the cross, intense suffering. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. Being given sour wine on hyssop to drink, the curtain torn, his mother and John being present. It is finished. The pain and torture prior, crown of thorns. Someone helped Jesus carry the cross.
All right. 2 more details and then we'll wrap this up.
Jesus forgiving those who crucified him, and John being told to take care of his mother.
All right, that's a great place to pause for a moment. Thank you. Don't go too far though, Megan. So
I'll be around.
So here we have, just from a pop quiz, a moment of just reflection and recall, details that we sort of just have as memory, remote memory of the crucifixion story, and details that we want to pay attention to. I want to switch to doing what biblical scholars tend to do best, which is actually look at a text. So I could not pull all of the text, so I ended up picking the Gospel of Mark's version, Mark 15, to look at. Again, I'm looking at the crucifixion story here specifically, and I want to read it for those who are primarily listening. Let me read Mark 15, verses 25 through 37, and verses 40 through 41. New Revised Standard Version, I believe, is what I'm using, just so it can ground us, anchor us in this conversation. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The notice of the formal charge against him was written, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 outlaws with him, one on his right and one on his left. People walking by insulted him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ha! So you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, were you? Save yourself and come down from that cross." In the same way, the chief priests were making fun of him among themselves, together with the legal experts. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross. Then we'll see and believe. Even those who had been crucified with Jesus insulted him. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, the whole earth was dark. At 3, Jesus cried out with a loud shout, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you left me?" After hearing him, some standing there said, "Look, he's calling for Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, and put it on a pole. He offered it to Jesus to drink, saying, "Let's see if Elijah will come to take him down." But Jesus let out a cry and died. Some women were watching from a distance, including Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, the younger one, and Joseph and Salome. When Jesus was in Galilee, these women had followed him and supported him, along with many other women who had come to Jerusalem with him. All right. This is our anchoring text, Mark 15's version of the crucifixion account. Now I want you to do something else. Take a moment to add a few details that you forgot or did not remember, that having read this or heard this account from Mark, you now want to put on record. So are there some fresh details, some other details that you went, that's right. That's a part of the story too, that we want to take account of. And Megan, I need you back again, my friend. Let's see if we have any additions to our record in terms of the stories, the details of crucifixion that we want to pay attention to. Give you a few seconds. If you're not adding in the chat box, you're doing it on your own, then I ask on that piece of paper, just as scribes, to hold yourself accountable. What details did you hear or read from Mark that you want to take note of now that you did not have originally on your sheet? All right, it looks like we are, we're getting some data and some feedback. So Megan, how about you read off some of the new details you see?
Sure thing. So the taunting has come up a couple times. The sponge soaked with wine, the timeline of it, that he died at 3, it was a 9 to 3 event, ridicule by passersby, crowds jeering, the formal charge, asking for proof that he's the Messiah, the 2 thieves, calling Elijah, people calling for him to save himself, that women followed him from Galilee, the whole earth turned dark, Jesus asking the Father, did the Father forsake him?
Two more details and we'll leave it at that.
Sure thing. The curtain of the temple being torn. And chief priest making fun.
I will take it. Yes, that name calling. And I have an elementary, a 4th grader. So the need to be nice on the playground and make sure people are being nice to you and not calling you names is the sort of thing we say in our household. So you see this sort of name calling and the jeering and the taunting. I love this recognition of some of the relationships that are around in this cycle as well. It's important for you to pay attention to the language that I'm using. So I am specifically talking about Mark 15, 25 to 37 and verses 40 through 41, using the language of crucifixion or death on the cross. That is intentional and should not be confused with sort of a collapsing of talking about the entirety of the passion cycle, which includes, when you talk about the passion and the entire cycle, it includes the process of capture, indictment, in a series of investigations or trials, which really start in chapter 14 in the Gospel of Mark and go through right up to this moment. So right around Mark 15, verse 20. So when I talk about the crucifixion cycle, the crucifixion moment, the death on the cross, it's a very specific moment in the story that I want to pay attention to. And so here is sort of a quick mapping for you of the story, particularly of crucifixion, that I am mapping here, which is embedded in this larger passion cycle, literarily speaking. So when I talk about crucifixion, I'm fundamentally talking about the entire cycle of death pageantry that the Gospel of Mark in this case stages for us. So it is the decision to crucify. It is the staging of crucifixion. It is the moment of death, and it is the witness of death. So to talk about the crucifixion story, particularly in Mark, is to talk about all four of these. So I can't cover them all in our time, but we want to pay attention to these four movements of crucifixion that occur in the larger Markan story frame. The first movement, the decision to crucify, as I focus on it, occurs specifically in 1513 with the crowd's demand to crucify him. This sort of, notice, is a public and communal commitment and demand and action of crucifixion. So what does it mean to think about crucifixion as not just something that comes from on high, down from on high, from the authorities or from a military of movement and execution practices of the Roman Empire, and we will get to that in a second, but also to see crucifixion as something that bubbles up from below, that it comes from this sort of community declaration, commitment, decision, right? Request to crucify him. Mark chapter 15, verses 6 through 15. The second movement, the staging of crucifixion, or the way I will talk about it, is the theater of death. We see this in Mark 15, verses 16 through 32. This includes all the props, all of the characters or the people, all the actions and settings that get us closer to the death moment. We are literally talking about the crucifixion of Jesus as a spectacle of Jesus's agony. So what does it mean to talk about crucifixion? Jesus's crucifixion story, as we encounter it here in Mark, as a spectacle of agony. This is in between a sort of liminal space. So this liminal space, I'm picking up here from Victor Turner, coined this notion of a liminal space. Here, Jesus is between the beginning of his death-dealing predicament, so the staging is the beginning of it, and its conclusion. In the middle space, we see a series of onlookers, or witnesses even, and spectators, all of whom are slinging or taunts or verbal attacks and sarcastic taunts, I love this, at him as he struggles to breathe, struggles to live, struggles to believe that even in this horrendous moment, God is yet present, so to speak. So this second movement, this staging of crucifixion is a liminal moment. It is, we're not quite at the beginning, but we're not at the death moment in and of itself. And yet they're staging. People, actors are being identified. There is a setting, there are props, there are actions that are taking place. It is a spectacle of death that is being what? I keep using this word because it's very important in this conversation, I think. Staged. Terror that is being staged for public consumption and public participation. The third movement, the moment of death itself, which we just finished reading. This is where Jesus actually dies. And the question is, how does he die? It is a slow death. It is a quick death. It is an innocent death. It is a just death. All of these are possibilities and versions that you see playing out, not just in Mark, but across the Gospels themselves. So each Gospel has a different commentary on what kind of death we see taking place on the cross, as well as when you get into the letters themselves. So the letters of the New Testament, and you begin to encounter these stories or retellings of the death moment, of the crucifixion moment. How is the death of Jesus understood at this moment? How does he die? Slow, quick, innocent, just, unjust, horrendous. I mean, these are important details to pay attention to as we look at the different accounts across the New Testament. And the fourth movement is the witness of death. Mark 15:39 through 41, which is why I like to read that last piece about the women. We see those who watched and who this made an impression on. So we also see them as sort of the face of larger communities and families and kinships that are impacted by the death moment. So you're not just thinking about Mary Magdalene, for instance, but Mary Magdalene representing what? Mary Magdalene is, her name comes from the location, a village, Magdala, which years earlier experienced a mass series of crucifixions because that community revolted against the Roman Empire. So that name, the very name, Mary Magdala, carries a story of a people, of a village that has close familiarity with not just crucifixion, but the crucifixion of a mass of people that is felt throughout the entire village. So the witness of death that we encounter in Mark's version, in Mary Magdalene and the other women, relates to history that predates the crucifixion. It also relates to the communities that are right there represented in terms of the disciples. And if you look in John, the Gospel of John, Jesus' mother and so forth, these kinship ties. And then it also is an invitation to think about and entertain the witnesses of crucifixion death that are available yet to us on this side of history. And that's where we will be turning in just a few moments. So here again, I'm specifically talking about the crucifixion cycle embedded within the Passion story. And when you talk about crucifixion, though I have pulled out specifically that third movement, the moment of death, what is really in the room of the conversation here are the entirety of these four movements: the decision to crucify, the staging of crucifixion, the moment of death, and the witness of death. I have a little bit of source material that I want to give you in terms of supporting this as we think about the social, not even background to this story. I call this the foreground. This is the ground, the social, historical context out of which and from which crucifixion would make sense and has significance. So whenever we crucify criminals, we place them where the greatest number of people can watch and be influenced by this threat. For every penalty is aimed not so much at the offense as at its exemplary value. Where did this come from? This is from a primary source, Quintilian, a Roman educator and rhetorician right there in the first and second, early second century. Roman crucifixion here is described as terror, and practically speaking, it is crowd control. It is a means exercised by the Roman Empire to publicly address any challenges to imperial domination and order. It is a warning to the masses of what happens to those disrupting the propagandized peace of Rome, the Pax Romana, in their local areas and beyond. So to think about Jesus' crucifixion and to only think about Jesus, like this is about Jesus, well, is it? Because the whole point of crucifixion in the Roman Empire is really not about those who are being crucified. It is about those who witness the crucifixion. It is the crowd control, the staging, again, the theater of crucifixion that is of what Quintilian names here of exemplary value. Okay, next one. Here's another description of crucifixion from the ancient world that I find particularly helpful. And so let me give a little bit of background of this. This is from Cicero, so a Roman statesman and attorney, is his persecution, his defense, his prosecutory speech against Varus, who has engaged in this particular spectacle of crucifixion that's important to pay attention to. Here we go. And so, gentlemen of the jury, in the middle of the forum in Messana, a Roman citizen was flogged, and the whole time while he suffered, while the whip cracked, no groan, no cry of any kind was heard from the tortured man, except, "I am a Roman citizen." Varus chose this spot so that Italy might see her own son hanging there, suffering the most horrible punishment ever inflicted on slaves. To put a Roman citizen in chains is wrong. To flog him is a crime. To execute him is almost parricide. And what shall I call crucifixion? So abominable a deed can find no word adequate enough to describe it. Yet even a crucifixion did not satisfy Varus. Let him gaze upon his native land. Let him die within sight of justice and liberty. Again, this is a passage taken from Cicero, so early second century Roman statesman, attorney, his persecution, his prosecutory speech about Varus and how Varus fundamentally crucified publicly a Roman citizen for the intentional purpose of enacting the pageantry, the crowd control, the warning that I was talking about earlier. So a few things are important to notice here that are presumed as understood or expected that you automatically know this, that we want to keep in mind. In the ancient world, Roman citizens could not be executed for capital offenses. Three groups of people were typically crucified. So notice I say typically, because as soon as you say all the time, there's always exceptions, right? So I'm talking about sort of the general trends that the material, the historical material, the primary source material provides for us. Under Roman law, none of which Jesus was until the time of crucifixion. Jesus was a free Galilean peasant class person, non-citizen of Rome, but free, in which he was charged, the charge of Jesus, King of the Judeans, Mark 15, verse 26. Three groups of people were typically crucified under the Roman law. These include runaway enslaved people, traitors of the Roman state, and political revolutionaries or insurrectionists. Again, earlier at the very beginning of my presentation, I raised the question of who was Jesus, not before crucifixion, but at the moment of crucifixion. What is the status? What is the identity? What is the role that is mapped onto Jesus as a result of crucifixion? Because crucifixion was about sending a public message, a public naming of who you become if you engage in any one of these three acts. An enslaved person who runs away, someone who is designated a traitor of the Roman Empire, or political revolutionaries or insurrectionists. So crucifixion and citizenship in the Roman Empire were fundamentally incompatible in the Roman-controlled world of Jesus, supposedly. So ideally, crucifixion and citizenship were incompatible. This point is made clear in this Cicero's published judicial speech, which is setting forth again his prosecutor's evidence against Gaius Varus. Varus was a senator and governor of Sicily right around 73, 76, Common Era, who stood trial on charges of extortion. And in addition to matters of extortion, Cicero presented convincing evidence against Verus for a list of other unlawful acts. Verus was very busy, to say the least, which includes this crucifixion of a Roman citizen. The passage has been quoted at length here, hopefully giving you time to read and reread it as a way to sort of orient you to sort of the general sense about crucifixion that actually plays out in the law courts of Rome in the early 2nd century that we want to pay attention to. One more example from a primary source that I want to read. The question marks here in yellow are intentional. The crowds at Crucifixion were by no means passive or disembodied voyeurs. They cheered, they hooted, they clapped, they grabbed souvenirs, and at times participated. Nor was the spectacle entirely dominated by visual sensation. Crucifixion included not only the sight of Black desecration, but also other senses. Spectators heard the speeches of the mob, the shouts of the crowd, the confessions of the victim, and most of all, his dying shrieks and cries. In cases where the victim was burned, to witness a crucifixion was also to smell it. And in all instances, the feel and push of the crowd created the sense of belonging and commonality that sustained violence. In this respect, spectators did not watch or consume a crucifixion as much as they witnessed it. That is, they beheld or experienced it with active engagement. I kept my voice, I intentionally put that inflection on there about crucifixion because in fact, this is not a description of crucifixion. This is a description from a historian who traces the realities and characteristics of American lynch culture from 1890 to 1940. So everywhere that I have placed the question mark highlighted in yellow is actually not the use of, is not the word crucifixion, but lynching that is being used in this piece. So this is a description of American lynching running from the 1890s to 1940s. And I am struck every time I read this and every time that I sort of look at the source material in this way, how if the word lynching was not used in this piece, there is very little difference in the descriptions of crucifixion that I encounter, either looking in Quintilian's description, Cicero's description, or even paying attention to the details in the accounting of Jesus' crucifixion as it is tracked and described in the gospel accounts themselves. So how might we resource the historical American record of lynching, particularly as it is understood through African-American biblical history? One of the ways, one of the other features of my work is work with Howard Thurman. I want to provide a quick reading of Thurman that offers us about the crucifixion scenario, particularly in the Gospel of Mark. But then I want to quickly move to this sort of resourcing, particularly of the lynching culture of the 1890 to 1940s as a resource for this. Thurman says, the crucifixion of Jesus reminds us once again of the penalty which any highly organized society exacts of those who violate its laws. The social resistors fall into two general groups: those who resist the established order by doing the things that are in opposition to accepted standards of decency and morality, the criminal, the antisocial, the outlaw, and those who resist the established order because of its requirements are too low, too unworthy of the highest and best in a person. Each is a menace to organized society, and both must be liquidated as disturbers of the peace. whenever a Jesus Christ is crucified, there will also be crucified behind him the thief, the two symbols of resistance to the established pattern. I bring this up because this is important. Here, prior, right in the early 20th century, we have Howard Thurman making the case that we need to examine the account of Jesus' crucifixion as not the account, but a account. Where might we find the other Jesus Christ who are crucified? Thurman seems to think they exist. So this, whenever a Jesus Christ is crucified, that's not a that I did not misprint that. That Thurman thinks that there are other Jesus Christ crucified. Where might we find those resources? Let me take you to that quickly. One place that I want to take us to is African American biblical histories of crucifixion, particularly resourcing the period of the Harlem Renaissance as a place for us to engage this. The Harlem Renaissance was an intellectual and cultural movement of African American musicians, artists, poets, writers, intellectuals and academics, dancers, fashion designers, theater, and more. It focused in Harlem, Manhattan, and New York City from the 1920s. It was focused there from the 1920s to the 1930s. So in some ways, short-lived, but it functioned synonymously with the 1925 term that was coined by Alain Locke in his anthology called The New Negro Movement. So this Harlem Renaissance piece was also a part of this larger reconceptualizing of the role and the place of African Americans and citizens and its citizenry in this country as well that we don't want to miss. At the same time that we have this going on, and as I had shared before, is in fact the mapping of crucifixion, of the mapping, the staging of lynching, the staging of lynching. So 1890 to 1940. So you see the Harlem Renaissance is born and occurring at the time that we're dealing with the apex and the phenomenon of lynching in America. Lynchings were most frequent between the periods 1890 to the 1920s. One of the peaks was 1892, but another peak was there in the 1920s as well. Lynching is a premeditated murder committed by a group of people by extrajudicial action, according to one description. Lynchings in the United States first became common in the southern United States in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, at which time most of the victims actually during that period were white men. Lynchings shifted, particularly to this extrajudicial action against African American bodies, particularly with the rise and quick withdrawal of the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. So this becomes a part of this sort of the South's propaganda of redemption and the drawdown of this brief period of Reconstruction. What takes its place as a way of what? Crowd control, as a way of fear, as a way of pageantry, as a way of policing, is the rise of lynching as a mechanism towards African American bodies. It's also very important to recognize that although this is often mapped on regionally to the South, lynchings were occurrences across the United States. So no, it did not just stay in the southern states. There are sources across the country of lynching taking place against African bodies and families and communities. So I want to highlight very clearly that this is an American story of lynching, an American story of crucifixion across the country that we want to hold in tension with this Mark 15 story of Jesus' crucifixion. All right, so I'm going to get to a little bit of show and tell very quickly. How might we resource the Harlem Renaissance? Well, the artists and writers and poets and teachers of the Harlem Renaissance provided a lot of resources, interpretive resources of understanding this phenomenon of lynching that had touched the African-American communities and many of them personally as well. The way that they interpreted crucifixion, lynching, was often through the crucifixion cycle. So to talk about Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus' death on the cross, and all four of those movements that I mapped out for you in Mark 15, according to Harlem Renaissance artists, is synonymous to talking about lynching and vice versa. So crucifixion becomes a way of interpreting and understanding lynching, and lynching is a way of understanding and interpreting the crucifixion account. Here I have James Weldon Johnson's, a portion of James Weldon Johnson's poem. James Weldon Johnson, 1887 to 1938, was an American writer and civil rights activist of the Harlem Renaissance, a composer, and he served various roles in the NAACP. The passage that I have for you posted is a selection from Johnson's 1927 book of poems, patterned after African-American rhetorical and oratorical and interpretive traditions. The larger piece is called God's Trombones, 7 Negro Sermons in Verse. This is the 5th sermon. The crucifixion is the 5th sermon in the series, in Weldon's series called God's Trombones, the series begins with crucifixion and it ends with the 7th sermon as the Judgment Day. So we are looking at the 5th sermon, crucifixion. Johnson says this about this scenario: I remember hearing in my boyhood sermons that were current, sermons that passed with only slight modifications from preacher to preacher and from locality to locality. Such sermons were the Valley of Dry Bones, which was based on the vision of the prophet in the 37th chapter of Ezekiel, the train sermon, in which both God and the devil were pictured as running trains, one loaded with saints that pulled up in heaven, and the other with sinners that dumped its load in hell, the heavenly march, which gave in detail the journey of the faithful from earth on up through the pearly gates to the great white throne. Then there was a stereotype sermon, which had no definite subject and which was quite generally preached. It began with creation, went on to the fall of man, rambled through the trials and tribulations of the Hebrew children, came down to the redemption by Christ, and ended with the Judgment Day and a warning and an exhortation to sinners. So this is James Weldon Johnson sort of describing the logic and the rationale of this collection of sermons, poetic sermons that he created here. I want to read very quickly a portion of this so that you can hear it. When you ask, so here's the intellectual exercise. When you ask Johnson in 1927, what pop quiz James Weldon Johnson, what are the details of crucifixion that you remember and must account for if he had to take our pop quiz? Look at what Johnson gives us. On Calvary, they crucified my Jesus. They nailed him to the cruel tree, and the hammer rang through Jerusalem's streets. The hammer rang through Jerusalem's streets. Jesus, my lamb like Jesus, shivering as the nails go through his hands. Jesus, my lamb like Jesus, shivering as the nails go through his feet. Jesus, my darling Jesus, groaning as the Roman spear plunged in his side. Jesus, my darling Jesus, groaning as the blood came spurting from his wound. Oh, look how they done my Jesus. I want to pause for a very quick moment and give you a chance to pay attention to what you might remember or think about the crucifixion cycle, what details you might have in mind now. When you hear James Weldon Johnson answer our pop quiz about what are the details of crucifixion in 1927, standing in the middle of American lynch culture and practices of your African-American communities, America's African-American communities that are significant for you here. Johnson gives us this response. I want to give you a moment just to note any new details, any new perspectives, any new words or realities that you would want to account for. I'm doing that very quickly because I'm almost at my time. So let me give you one more very quickly. Another one, the last one that I'll leave you with, is from Countee Cullen. Countee Cullen is 1903, 1946, an American poet and novelist. He's also a children's writer from the Harlem Renaissance. This poem, the occasion of this poem, is actually in reference to the 1920s, intentionally about the lynchings across the US. In particular, he is talking about a particular set of lynchings that occurred right there. I'm blanking. So 1910 to the 1920s is the period of lynching that Countee Cullen is accounting for here as he thinks about the Christ re-crucified, particularly in the Southern context. Let me read it very quickly. The South is crucifying Christ again. By all the laws of ancient rote and rule, the ribald cries of save yourself in fool. Din in his ears, the thorns grope for his brain, and where they bite, swift springing rivers stain. His gaudy purple robe of ridicule, with sullen red and acid wine to cool. His thirst is thrust at him with lurking pain. Christ's awful wrong is that he's dark of hue, the sin for which no blamelessness atones. But lest the sameness of the cross should tire, they kill him now with famished tongues of fire. And while he burns, good men and women too shout, battling for black and brittle bones. I know that I am at my time, Megan, so let me just say very quickly in summary here, back to particularly Thurman's notion, whenever a Jesus Christ is crucified, there will also be crucified behind him the thief, two symbols of resistance to the established pattern. But I want to underscore, whenever Jesus Christ is crucified, African-American interpretive history, particularly from the Harlem Renaissance or from a biblical interpreter such as Howard Thurman, we begin to see that crucifixion is not simply an ancient biblical occurrence, but it has an ongoing history right here in the present moment with us. Its name has changed: crucifixion, lynching, profiling, incarceration, immigrant detention centers. And yet the smells, the bodily harm, the sounds, the sensory nature of crucifixion, which is one that we often miss in our accountings and details of the crucifixion story in the biblical text, is as present and potent and necessary for our accurate reading and interpretation of crucifixion in this season of Lent and Easter as any of those other narrative details that we give. I hope this gives you something to think about and hold on to. Megan, I turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith, and I echo some of the posts in the chat. Outstanding. Thank you so much. Time well spent. I'm glad we went right up to the hour with your presentation because you definitely gave us so much to think about. We're conscious that we normally have time for Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to email it to us, or you can put it in the chat right now and we can get it to Dr. Smith for her to answer them. So thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for your presentation. Our next webinar is going to be on Thursday, April 7th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time for our third annual Daniel J. Harrington S.J. lecture. It is called Spirituality for Mission, Connecting in an Era of Disconnectedness. The speaker is going to be Professor Mary Ann Confoy. She's a religious sister of charity of the Jesuit College of Spirituality in Melbourne, Australia. We're also going to include the Alumni Distinguished Service Award during this presentation. Information about this event is going to be in the follow-up email that we send. Thank you for joining us this evening. We hope that you have a great rest of your day.